But let's get back to diet, because you don't really need all of that, although there's a role for it. And so after doing a little homework, I never really learned how you got onto fasting, because for me it was seeing a couple people doing a low carb diet. And it clearly worked. Did you see some people using it, or
No,
kind of got onto the kind of
it
face validity of it?
it was essentially what happened was that so as I was thinking about it, I was thinking that really the cause of a lot of these problems is the hyperinsulinemia, which is too much insulin, right?
Yeah.
So, and it's not necessarily the
Well,
postprandial insulin, but
sorry to interrupt. I was hoping when I said what causes insulin resistance, you would just say hyperinsulinemia.
yeah.
Yeah,
But
good.
hyperinsulinemia, yeah, it's the same thing as insulin resistance, right? So if you have too much insulin, you're basically letting that cell fill up with glucose, right? You have high levels of insulin, high levels of glucose, you're filling up that cell with insulin. And at some point, right, it's going to fill up and then you can't put any more glucose in. So hyperinsulinemia, the high insulin, to me is sort of the big cause of the entire problem, not just type 2 diabetes, but also metabolic syndrome, but also obesity. Because if you think about it, insulin is a hormone and it's a normal hormone, right? And its whole job is to tell you to store fat. Like that's really a big, big job of insulin. And it's not that it's a bad thing. We need it to survive,
Yeah.
obviously. But if it's too high, like any hormone, if it's too high is bad, and if it's too low is bad. Thyroid hormone, parathyroid hormone, growth hormone, and the whole thing, every single hormone, it's neither good nor bad. It's just that the level is supposed to be in a certain range. And if it goes too high, it's bad. So insulin is a normal hormone. So there's nothing wrong with it. But if it's in too high a range, you're going to have certain diseases, right? And it's pretty logical because insulin, its job, so you eat, insulin goes up. As insulin goes up, your body says you should store some of these calories because you're going to need it later when insulin goes down. Because when you go to sleep and you're not eating, your body still needs energy. So at that point, insulin goes down. Your body now says, okay, let me burn some of this energy, right? So you eat, insulin goes up. It says store energy. And you don't eat, you go to sleep. It's a fasting period. Your insulin goes down. Your body says, all right, let's pull some of those calories back out and let's burn them for energy. And that's the reason you don't die in your sleep every single night, because your body has that ability. Now, if you have a situation where insulin is high all the time and it's way too high, it's much higher than normal levels, well, what's going to happen? Well, you're going to store more energy because you basically told your body to store more energy. So there's two situations where you have to think about, okay, why is the insulin too high diet wise? Well, either the foods you're eating are stimulating a lot of insulin, and you have to remember that different foods will stimulate insulin to different degrees, right? So that means that different foods will tell your body to either store that energy or not, right? And the other thing is how long, over what period of time are you telling that body to store, right? Because if it spikes up really high and then goes really low, well, you're going to start using it, right? So if it spikes up for 1 hour of the day and the other 23 hours of the day, it's low. Well, that one single spike probably doesn't make an overall big deal of difference because it's low for the other 23 hours. So that's why I thought, okay, well, the diet is one aspect of hyperinsulinemia, but the other aspect is how often you eat. And remember, at this time, it was like 2013, 2014, people were convinced that you had to eat like 10 times a day. Like that was absolutely necessary for
Yeah.
optimal human health, even though in the past, people never ate that way. Why? Because there was not all this processed food, right? Like who's going to, get up, make yourself eggs and bacon in the morning, eat it, and then at 10:30 go and make yourself, bake yourself a little muffin or something just for that, right? Like, don't you have to work, right? And so it was this whole idea that you had to eat constantly. But in the past, nobody did that. Like in the 1800s, who was snacking constantly? Nobody. Everybody had to work in the fields. Everybody had to go, to the factories. Nobody's stopping in the middle of the day to constantly eat. Nobody was eating in the middle of the day. Even if you think back to the 70s, nobody's
Did
eating
you
at their
have
desk.
did you have vending machines in your high school?
No,
We didn't.
nowhere. nowhere. If you were hungry, it was the middle of like it was 10:30, 10:35, or it was 4 o'clock after school, you're hungry, your mom's like, no, you're gonna ruin your dinner, right? There's no after school snacks. Like you just sucked it up until dinner time. You ate at those specific times because really there people are just too busy doing other things.
Yeah,
Then
and
of
I find
course,
myself saying it's okay not to eat so much.
yeah. Yeah. So it's not just the amount that you eat, it's also what you eat because different foods have different insulin effect, but it's also how often you eat. Because if you're not
So,
letting your body drop into
well,
sort of the low insulin levels, then you're
so,
not burning those calories.
so you just saw food, any food. I mean, some food raises insulin, so just cut it all out. Is that how you got on this,
Well,
or?
then I thought, well, okay, so what if you cut it all out? Like that's the logical conclusion as to what it like how far to take it, right? And so then I thought, oh, what a bad idea, right? Everybody knew that if you had to eat 10 times a day, that was just sort of a given. This is 2013, 2014. And so I was thinking but then I thought about it. It's like, well, wait a second. So I think that it's really bad to not eat for, 14, 16 hours of the day. But wait a second, as a physician, I tell people to do that all the time, right? So if you want to, you come into hospital, you have pancreatitis, NPO, right? Nothing, nil
Yeah,
per os, you don't eat. If you're pre-op, you don't eat. If you're post-op, you don't eat. If you go for a colonoscopy, you don't eat.
yeah,
So
that's
there was
NPO,
uh,
nothing per oral,
nothing,
right?
yeah,
NPO.
per oral, yeah. And even if you did fasting blood work, you had to fast. If you did an ultrasound, you had to fast. So literally every working day, I'm telling people, well, you got to fast for your blood work. You got to fast for your ultrasound. You got to
Don't
fast for your
eat.
colonoscopy. You just had surgery. You can't eat. Like literally every day, I'm telling people 4, 5, 6 times a day not to eat. Did anything really bad happen to their metabolism? No, not at all. And it was very funny because I remember at that time, I was taking a lot of care of a lot of post-ICU patients. And people in the ICU were very sick. They'd have pneumonia or something. They'd be intubated. You couldn't feed them for different reasons. And they'd go in on like 100 units of insulin and they'd come out and they'd be on nothing, no insulin. Their diabetes was
Yeah.
completely gone because their sugars were completely normal. And then they started eating again, but their sugars were still normal. I was like, whoa, what happened? Like, why did they go in there with like so much insulin requirements and they come out with like none? And it wasn't happening like, once or twice. I'd see it like at least once or twice a month. I'd see these cases. I was like, huh, very interesting. And what could be the cause of it? And that's where I start to think, what's the mechanism and so on. That's where I started to realize that, hey, fasting's not that bad for you. In fact, it can be very good for you in those situations
You
where
know,
you have too much glucose.
I had the great fortune of going around with Adapt Your Life, my company, and do Saturday morning events. And there would be 300, 350 people there in pre-pandemic. And I would ask for a couple of meetings, I asked, how many of you have ever gone a day without eating? Nothing. Nobody. And
Yeah,
and how many of you have ever seen someone else go a day without eating? Maybe a few hands, because in the hospital, we saw it all the time.
yeah,
People were too sick to eat.
yeah,
And so the common experience, shared experience now is that we've always eaten all the time.
yeah,
And you're telling people not to. That
yeah.
seems
So
weird.
it was very weird. So as I started to talk about it, so then I went back into literature and I thought, well, what's so bad? What's really so bad about not eating for 16, 18, 20, 24 hours, even up to several days, right? And when you go back in the literature, you quickly find that there was actually nothing wrong. Like
Well,
you can find nothing
that's
wrong
like there should be
unless you're
studies.
very
There should be all these studies showing people dying left and right, right?
Yeah, now there were in the 60s actually a few, but they were like crazy. These studies were crazy. Like in the 60s, you did, there's no research ethics boards and stuff. Like they did crazy stuff. So there were a few people who were not like they take people who are pretty skinny already and then fast them for like 30 days or something like that, right? And it was like, okay, that's ridiculous. I remember reading one study in I think it was nine patients or something like that, right? They fasted them like 9 days or something like that. And these are skinny people, right? They didn't have a lot of obese people. Skinny people, they'd fast them like 9 or 10 days, nothing to eat at all. And then they gave them a big slug of IV insulin. And it's like, why? Why? They just wanted to see what would happen.
Well, I mean, you could probably do that again under close monitoring. But that reminds me of Ansel Keys. And at some of our meetings, you'd say Ansel Keys, and there'd be these boos from the audience as one of the, evil people in this whole story. But anyway, he did the starvation studies
Yeah.
where the idea was, what do you do when someone's been in a concentration camp post World War II and the refeeding was an issue? All the coincidences. One of my choir members, I sat next to him in a choir I was in here in North Carolina, had been in that study years
Oh,
ago
wow.
with Professor Keys. It was an amazing coincidence, but that probably got starvation a bad name in
Yeah,
the
it did. And the funny part about that study, if you read the biology of human starvation, which is the study he wound up publishing in the 50s, it was actually their diet was actually 1,540 calories, which is and it was a very low fat diet because they wanted to replicate what was available in post World War II Europe. So they
yeah.
had high starch because remember protein and fat are relatively expensive, right? Meat is expensive, fat is expensive. So people were eating turnips and all this other stuff. So it was a low fat diet, 1,540 calories a day, which was actually 40% less than the Americans were eating at that time. But it's like that's actually what most experts prescribed for
Recommend.
decades, right? You're supposed to cut 500 calories. You were supposed to eat 2,000 calories. You're supposed to cut it down to 1,500 and cut the fat. So that was that starvation study, which showed how bad it really was actually what we had been taught to prescribe for decades and decades. And then we wondered why everybody was going crazy on these diets and it wasn't working. Well, we proved it like 50 years ago, 60 years ago.
Well, and I have to say, from your vantage point in Toronto, I think you have a more worldly view than us typical Americans who think the whole world revolves around the US. You started incorporating the idea that other cultures or in religions fast, and what about that tradition? What have you learned?
Yeah,
What is the
it's
science?
actually that's what's very interesting because ultimately people have been fasting for thousands of years. If you look at really any major religion, they all have traditions of fasting. So if fasting was really, truly so bad for us, well, we should have figured that out sometime
There
in the
wouldn't have been
past
there wouldn't have
2,000
been a
years.
survival
Yeah,
advantage.
that's right. We wouldn't have survived. And if you think about it, it's like if you don't eat, so your body has this ability to store energy, which is calories, right? You can store it as glucose, right? You can store it as glycogen in the liver, or you can store it as body fat. Either way, those are the body's ways of storing energy. So if you don't eat, your body is going to use either the glucose or the body fat because that's a source of energy. And that is precisely the reason you have body fat. It's not there for looks. It's there for you as a source of energy in case you don't eat. So you're simply providing the situation where your body needs to go into its stores and burn off the glucose. So if you're type 2 diabetic and you have too much glucose, hey, your body's going to burn it off. And that's good. You're not going to need those drugs. And I have no problem with those drugs, right? I prescribe a lot of drugs as a physician, but you can do it completely naturally for no cost, right? And if you have too much body fat, you can do exactly the same thing and force your energy to use its stored sources. And in other words, what you're trying to do is force your body to eat its own glucose and eat its own fat that is already stored away. And that's natural.
Historically, and I value the looking back, that we can have information or even current cultures. How long do people fast? The Indonesia, I gave a talk there and learned from some doctors there. They combine the daytime fasting with nighttime keto, and they have a group called Keto Fastosis Indonesia. And They actually, that's where I first learned about keto babies. I didn't know that was a term. And these are moms who do keto diets who, and the pediatrician I met, and it's just anecdotal, of course, that the babies do great when their moms don't eat carbs or as many carbs. But so historically, I think of Jesus going out in the wilderness with 30 days or something. I mean, was it just daytime fasting, or was it total fasting or water fasting? And now I'm learning all these different names
Yeah, it's
for
all
different.
different. So you have different fasting traditions basically. So you have, say, the Greek Orthodox who have different fasts, and not sometimes what they call fasting is actually they don't eat meat, for example. They're cutting out one sort. You have say the Muslims who do Ramadan, and they won't eat from sort of sun up to sundown. So it's probably like what, 12, 14 hours, 16 hours, but they do a dry fasting, which means that they don't drink water either. You have, say, Buddhists who will often not eat after, say, 12 o'clock, like noontime, until the next day. So they're going sort of like 18 hours, something like that. So you have all different fasting traditions. Some Jews have their fasting tradition on Yom Kippur. During Lent, there are certain fasting traditions, and people do different things, right? Sometimes it's only like, remember, fish on Friday sort of thing. That was not a form of fasting, but a form of sort of dietary alterations on those days. So there are different fasting traditions, and I go to a Catholic church, and every time around Easter, they actually talk all about fasting, right? They're like, it's the passages they read, they're all about fasting and so on, which I always thought was very funny because at the time, 2013, 2014, when everybody said, oh, fasting is the worst thing you could possibly do to your body, all the time I'm in church, I'm listening to the pastor talk about
That's
fasting
just once a
and
week.
why you should fast and how it's good for you, how it cleanses you. And it's interesting because when you think about fasting, it was always tied into this idea of it being a very healthy tradition. That is, it wasn't fun. Nobody liked it. It wasn't for a good time, but it was something that you should do on a regular basis to sort of keep you healthy. And like even the word itself, breakfast, right? It's like the meal that breaks your fast. What
Fast,
it
yeah.
implies is that you have to fast in order to break your fast. You can't
Yeah,
be eating all the time.
I that took decades for me to break apart that word breakfast. And it's breaking you don't want to break the fast. Well,
Yeah,
so now
now,
what should we eat then? And this is where I really want to get
yeah.
your opinion and ideas, because the NIH group, one of them at least, that studies fasting, intermittent fasting, has them eat, I mean, a high carb meal once a day. And the
Yeah.
results were not all that great for weight loss. And so my approach is to teach, low carb, under 20 or 30 total grams per day. People fast from within, meaning they might eat once a day and all that. But so how do you work in different, how do you look at the macros, and does it matter? I mean, could you do the Skittles fast, for a month where
You
you're just
theoretically
having
you
sugar?
could, yeah, like theoretically you could, and you probably won't get all the benefits of the fasting because you're eating stuff that's relatively
Well, but
unhealthy.
let's talk about the optimal diet. I mean, getting your bells
Yeah,
to give
yeah, I
yourself the
would I
best.
would agree. Cutting down the refined carbohydrates, particularly, is probably, very, very important. I mean, the whole thing, if you look at weight loss, I mean, people who need to lose weight or people who type 2 diabetes, you have a situation where your insulin levels are too high. We know that, like obesity is associated, like when you measure the insulin levels of people who are obese, they are definitely higher, right, than normal.
Yes.
So same with type 2 diabetes. It's actually a spectrum. So obesity, you have normal people whose insulin levels are sort of normal, then obesity where they're high, and then pre-diabetes where they're higher, and then type 2 diabetes where they're even higher than that. So we know that hyperinsulinemia is and obesity and type 2 diabetes all go together. So if your insulin levels are high, then you should eat foods that don't raise your insulin levels so much. Like, I'm not sure why it's so controversial. Like,
Well,
it's
but there's a two-step process, right? There, carbohydrates raise the blood glucose, and is it sugar or is it glucose? I mean, and that raises the. I mean, it's hard to. There's just enough
Yeah.
things to make it hard to understand. But so I wish we go back to say sugar diabetes. It's what
Yeah,
they used
yeah.
to say in the
Well, if you think
South.
about carbohydrates, carbohydrates are sugar. That's just a
Well, in that
chemical
I had a
structure.
conversation recently. I had to draw out, G attached to G attached to G. This is what a starch is. It's
Yeah,
glucoses all
it's
together, and our bodies
all,
break down. So, I mean, most of us don't get much nutrition training,
yeah,
even in
and most
the general
doctors don't
public.
either, right? And again, it's not that hard to understand when you actually break it down to type 2 diabetes, you have too much glucose, right? So sugar is a nebulous term because it can include fructose, which is a different type of sugar. But let's just talk about
Yeah, don't get me on that
glucose.
distraction.
But if we just talk about glucose,
Yeah.
glucose, which is, you know, blood glucose is blood sugar, right? So fructose doesn't circulate free in the blood. So blood sugar is glucose. So glucose, and if you look at carbs, so bread, rice, potatoes, they're all glucose. So you take a highly refined, because remember, in nature, nothing is sort of 100% something, right? It's all a mix of stuff. So if you look at carbohydrates, so highly refined, say wheat, you take the wheat berry, you take out all the fat, you take out all the protein, and you're left with 100% carbohydrate, which is the flour. Now, that flour or the is basically all glucose. It's arranged in chains, and you can go down through the biochemistry. It's arranged in two forms, amylose and amylopectin, and those are broken down into glucose. So it's just glucose. So if your blood glucose is too high, as in you have type 2 diabetes, your blood glucose is too high, why would you want to eat all that glucose? Because you could eat an egg which has zero glucose. It has protein, which is amino acids. It has fats, but no
Yeah,
glucose.
something's happened though where I can teach this, and the people don't believe me. They want me to prescribe them a glucometer. Now that, the CGMs, you can get them, they're about $100 a month if insurance doesn't pay. And people want me to prescribe because you need a doctor's order. And they'll pay $100 a month to test out what I'm saying. And so then they'll come back and say, what did you learn? Well, I learned that if I eat the things you told me not to eat, my glucose would go up. I said, see, I guess, there's a disconnect between not believing what doctors say, and I'm a doctor. Well, I
It's
get it.
because
You're
it's
not,
because the message is so muddied by all the other people out there, including a lot of doctors who say, "Oh, you should eat, low fat and lots of carbs, right? Oh, it's all about the calories." Like this bugs me the most. It's all about the calories, it's all about the energy. It's like it's all the same. It's like, how is it the same? Like there's all these people out there that are all about calories, calories, calories. I'm
well,
like,
David Ludwig did the article that brought together the calories in, calories out, and the carbohydrate insulin hypothesis players together in the paper, which basically said all of it, it all matters at some point. Because, if you do the naked and afraid diet where you're not eating anything, total fasting for 21 days, you lose a pound or two per day, you know.
yeah,
But
yeah.
I'm trying to get people to lose weight in the healthiest manner. So what should I eat that one meal a day then? Have you figured out, or is it really just up to what someone likes?
No, I mean there are definitely things that I mean you have to take your own situation. So again, this is where I think it's very strange because if you have a situation where somebody is type 2 diabetic or overweight and wants to lose weight, then cutting down the carbohydrate makes a lot of sense and intermittent fasting makes a lot of sense. On the other side, you have somebody who's not overweight, healthy, exercises a lot, and then they go, "Oh, well, I really need to go low carb and do fasting." I'm like, why? Like your insulin levels are not high. Why are you trying to lower them? There's no reason for you
Well,
to
I'm
need
getting,
to do this,
I
right?
want to be in ketosis, people tell me.
Yeah, yeah. It's like, but why, right? So it's
Well,
fine if
all
you want to
the
do it.
the anti-inflammatory effects, but well, the emerging science there. Well,
Yeah.
so do you have like a carb level, or I think in terms of total grams of
Yeah,
carbs per day.
I think about total grams too. I mean, I usually try and tell people to stay under 50 grams, so I'm probably a little bit more lenient than you.
Well,
But on the other
I have a
hand,
book
it's
that has 20, 50, 150, kind of the
oh, okay,
classic
yeah.
three-tier carb intake, and it's
Yeah,
not
but to
all.
be honest, even if you cut down to 150, most people are starting at 300 for 400. So even
Yeah.
at 150, which we think is, oh, that's really high, for a lot of
Well,
people, they'll do
this was
extraordinarily well.
this is to accommodate the metabolism of people like one of my brothers who is naturally athletic and, burns all that stuff off as if he could eat up to that many carbs a day. But therapeutically, yeah, so the context matters. For diabetes, under 50 total a day seems quite reasonable, especially if you one meal a day or intermittent fast. Is that reducing the calories as well, typically?
It should. I mean, in the ideal situation, you will the idea is not to take the 3 meals that you would have eaten and cram them all into a single meal, right? That's not the idea of intermittent
That's hard to
fasting.
do. Yeah.
It's hard to do, so that's good. But the idea is that if you normally eat, say, 3 meals a day and you drop one of them, the other one should stay the same or as close to the same as you can get it. And say you normally eat breakfast, lunch, and dinner, then you drop dinner and lunch and you're only eating breakfast, right? So now you should eat as normally as possible during lunch and during dinner. You're trying to force your body to eat the glucose that's in your blood or eat the body fat that's on your body so that you lose glucose, so yeah, you can reverse type 2 diabetes, or you lose fat so you can lose body fat, right? So that's the entire idea. So if you simply eat more on the meal that you do eat, well, you'll still do, you might do okay because it's really hard to eat a single giant meal compared to three, right? When you space them out, it's easier. Um, and a lot of studies show this, right? If you eat 3 meals compared to 2 meals, like one meal, or 6 meals, like the more often you eat, the more likely you are to eat more total,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? That's
And I hear
sort of
that
natural.
people tell me when I have breakfast, I want to eat more that day, which doesn't make sense if you're thinking of a fuel tank in a car fueling up, but it
Yeah.
makes total sense if you think about if you come upon an animal, you kill it, you eat it. It's
Yeah.
not like so eating makes some people want to eat
Yeah,
more.
once you start,
I
it's
hear
very
that.
hard to stop sometimes, right? Because
Yeah.
that's the way we're
Well,
all built.
Well, definitely with junk foods, the highly sugar and ultra processed foods for sure. Well, so
Yeah.
would it be reasonable then in someone in my clinic, my world, my patients, many of whom are watching, that if they can't wrap their head around a strict, perfect keto diet, if they incorporate the intermittent fasting, the one meal a day idea, and have a little carb just that one time a day, if they can stick to it, you might get the metabolic effects.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
the whole
That's,
idea is that they're all, part of the equation, right? So if one part, cutting the carbs, doesn't work for you at all, for whatever reason, right? There's lots of different reasons, people's diets, preferences, whatever.
yeah,
Um,
my mother makes me eat it.
Yeah. Then you can alter another part. So say you can't cut the carbs very well, then you can tinker with the fasting, right? They're all different things. Or if you do have carbs, maybe there's something else you can do, change the types of carbs so that they're not so refined, right? So there's different ways to change it so that it works out for you. And but I think, the cutting out the snacks is sort of a giant, like, because snacks weren't part of the sort of regular diet of people until the last 30, 40, 50 years. That part can be moved back because that's more of a societal thing rather than we really want to do it. And that was one of the big things I had fought against in 2013, 2014, was that idea that we needed to snack constantly to lose weight, as in, like, you need to eat all the time to lose weight. I'm like, how do you expect that to work? Like, honestly,
Yeah.
like, how do you lose
You
weight
eat
while
less.
eating?
To
Yeah,
lose weight, you eat less. I find myself
exactly.
saying that
It's
all
like
the time.
crazy.
Well, now, switching gears totally. I mean, then we got to wrap up. But this is so great. Can I have you come back some other time to
Yeah,
keep
sure.
talking? Really great to talk to you. Now, in the U.S., other countries, there's really no one who's been sued in the U.S. for doing this, despite people saying that it's not true. But other doctors in other countries have been in hot water from their professional standards boards and all, Tim Noakes in South Africa, Gary Fettke in Australia. Have you ever gotten into any entanglements? I mean, serious ones, not just trolls on the internet, but
Yeah, no, luckily I haven't. And part of
I
it
don't.
is because I think I focused a lot on the science and just education rather than like just explaining rather than saying you must and you know I think Tim Noakes and Gary both were unfairly targeted, truthfully. You know, that was honestly it was a total witch hunt like that. Those stories
Yeah.
are awful. Like they're just
Yeah.
awful. But
Well,
you know,
I know a few Canadian doctors who've been in hot water, although it's just been a hassle and they've been able to work it out. But uh, that's sad to see. I would hope by now, 2024, that organizations, countries realize that there are a lot of different ways to do this, and you're really just kind of a, I don't know, a patsy of someone with a different agenda other than science and helping people if you go after someone saying what you do and what I do. Now,
yeah,
last fall, the textbook on keto diets, ketogenic diet is out thanks to Prof. Noakes and the Nutrition
yeah,
Network.
yeah,
So,
yeah.
well, that's good to hear. And what would you want doctors to know?
I think I would want them to know for type 2 diabetes, like even if you look at the American Diabetes Association nutrition guidelines, they've actually completely changed, right? So low carb, cutting down the carbs used to be this sort of, you know, very fringe sort of way to do things. If you actually read the guidelines, they state like the low carb diet or cutting down the carbs is the diet with the most evidence, like the most evidence, like not Mediterranean, not low fat, not low calorie. It's low carb has the most evidence of any diet that has been scientifically studied for improving type 2 diabetes. For fasting, they basically say there's not a lot of data, which is true, but they do say that, hey, this is a very promising area. And in fact, it may be a way to achieve your nutritional goals, but without counting calories or counting carbs. So it's like, okay, well, that's a pretty good endorsement, given that there is not a lot of, you know, hard
Yep.
evidence at this point.
But it's like you're the best cello player on earth and you just play at your home. Nobody knows about it unless you go out in public. They should be doing public service announcements with
I
this,
know.
in
It's ridiculous.
right?
I mean, it's crazy because it's like low carb, you know, so here it is the ADA, right? So what we all reference, you know, as standard normal physicians will mostly reference the ADA in the United States, right? For diabetes. They're saying it has the most evidence, yet they don't say it. And even when you bring it up in big organizations like Level 2 and United Health, people are like, really? Like they're
Well,
like stunned. I'm like, what? It's there.
how we
It's
get
all there.
information, they need to have their, push it out on TikTok or I don't know.
Mm.
That's communication of getting information out is a whole nother thing. But thank you so much for all the work you've done and in your YouTube work, which is all available for free. That people have to remember that. And I just want to wrap up by saying thanks. And it was really good to know, really good to talk to you about what you can do as a physician when you think about the upstream, going upstream and stopping people from jumping in the river, that then they get all of these consequences. Any final thoughts for my patients? Now, I know if you can imagine your patients, just maybe a few thoughts for them.
I think the most important thing is to remember one, it is type 2 diabetes is a reversible disease, right? So that's really important. And again, it all changed around 2021, right? That's when the ADA first published criteria for remission, which says remission is possible. So it's not like, you know, the reason we struggle is because we've been taught for like as physicians, we've been taught for like 2, 3, 4 decades that it's chronic and progressive, and they've only changed it since 2021, right? That's like 2.5 years ago. That's why nobody says it. That's why none of the dietitians know it, none of the nurses know it, none of the educators know it, because it's relatively new. But you have to remember it's reversible. So therefore, it all changes. So the goal of type 2 diabetes care is not management, as you say, it's reversing it. Like, you should try to not have this disease. Of the diets you want to try, low carb has the most scientific evidence, and intermittent fasting can be a useful tool. And that's basically straight out of ADA and nothing you will hear anywhere else. So, that's great information because it's immediately actionable for people to say, okay, I get it. My blood glucose is high. I don't want to be eating a lot of glucose. Makes perfect sense to me. The foods that raise my blood glucose, I shouldn't be eating so many of those. That makes perfect sense. And now the science is behind you, the Diabetes Association is behind you. So, so now we have to figure out how to make it easy for people, get them to follow it and so on, right? And that's it's not to minimize the task, but at least the task of sort of the science of it is relatively like moving all in the direction. I mean, when you started talking about this, like, you're a lone voice in the wilderness, right? It was like, who else was around talking about it? Not a lot of people, right? It was quite interesting to go from that to where we are today, right?
Yeah, come a long way. Thank you. And how do people find you? What's the latest place to learn from Dr. Jason Fung?
Yeah, you can go to my Twitter on Dr. Jason Fung. You can go on YouTube, just look under my name, Jason Fung. And there's lots of videos there. I switched over. There's my books, which are available anywhere. The Obesity Code, Complete Diet to Fasting, the Diabetes Code. So you can go to any of those. And I also write a blog on medium.com. And, just FYI, Medium used to let you read stuff for free, but I've been using them for years. Now they don't, but I usually post a friend link so that if you just, follow me on Twitter, you can find that friend link and then get access to the article as opposed to having to pay for it through Medium. But I like medium.com because it's an easy place to keep my blog. That's all.
And what's the company you're working with now again?
I work with the fastingmethod.com. That's myself and Megan Ramos, who is also, we started sort of in our office together doing fasting for large groups. And, just now we're trying to take it to a larger audience online. And yeah, the fastingmethod.com has resources, it has groups, it has master classes, it has individualized coaching available for people who want that extra help. And of course, it also links to all of our free stuff because, hey, if people just want to learn about it, then hey, we're happy to share everything we know.
Wonderful. All great resources. And thank you so much for your time. Let's talk again. Okay.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Eric. Bye.
Bye-bye. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell, and check out adaptyourlifeacademy.com.